A look of helplessness crossed William Monroe's face. Shaking his head, he stood up and walked over to Melody Blackwood. "I told you, I want to protect you," he said, his voice as gentle as if he had become a different person. "Oh!" Melody Blackwood turned her head in surprise, just happening to meet his gentle gaze. The distance between them was less than an inch. Her face flushed involuntarily, and she instinctively took a step back, but a large, powerful hand stopped her waist. "What do you think?" he asked, his eyes filled with expectation and nervousness. Melody Blackwood's eyes flickered, a hint of nervousness flashing through her bright eyes. "This humble one is only the general's personal guard. I should be protecting the general." His ambiguous gaze made Melody Blackwood's heart beat faster involuntarily. "Is that so?" William Monroe whispered in her ear, his arms wrapped around her waist. Melody Blackwood's nerves tightened, her body stiffening involuntarily. She instinctively struggled, but found she couldn't muster any strength. Her red lips bit slightly, and annoyance flashed in her eyes. Glancing at his perfect profile, her face flushed even redder. Chapter 28. Scandal spreads throughout the camp. "General, men and women shouldn't be so close." Melody Blackwood spoke, finally managing to regain some strength. She pushed him away, taking a few steps back, and taking a deep breath to compose herself. "You are a man now." William Monroe's lips curved into a wicked smile. He paused, as if remembering something, and then said, "A man who wants to protect me." Having said that, he took another step forward and wrapped his arms around Melody Blackwood's waist again. His rhythmic breathing sounded in her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "General, the enemy is really—" Ethan Mortimer's voice gradually approached, but he abruptly stopped before finishing his sentence. Outside the general's tent, Ethan Mortimer, whose face was usually cold, now had his mouth agape in an O shape, his eyes fixed on the two embracing figures. Melody Blackwood's mind short-circuited, and she froze in place. "Lieutenant General Mortimer, what is it?" Another voice rang out, and the figures of several other generals appeared, their faces mirroring Ethan's shock. The soldiers outside, peering in curiously, also witnessed this earth-shattering scene. "Ahem!" General Lewis coughed lightly. Melody Blackwood, finally regaining her composure, hastily pushed him away, ducking her head and retreating to the resting area behind. This time, she'd utterly lost face. Sure enough, a sigh came from outside, followed by General Lewis's poignant words. William Monroe listened quietly, not daring to utter a single word of rebuttal. However, Ethan Mortimer's arrival also brought good news. The enemy forces, as Melody Blackwood had predicted, were employing a diversionary tactic, waiting for them to take the bait before dispatching their main army to seize the army's headquarters in one fell swoop. William Monroe immediately ordered Level 1 defenses and intensified the training of new recruits, striving to defeat the enemy in the next battle. The next day, having caught wind of their exposed scheme, the enemy forces dropped the pretense and decided to confront William Monroe head-on. Therefore, a second war could erupt between the two sides at any moment. The Grand General and his close bodyguard, Melody Blackwood, engaged in clandestine affections within their tent at midnight. Someone, with a loose tongue, spread this news throughout the entire camp. In an instant, everyone was convinced that William Monroe had a penchant for male homosexuality. Of course, those in the know were well aware that William Monroe had fallen under the spell of that male-disguised, actually female, individual. Melody Blackwood didn't feel anything untoward about it. Although the night had been suggestive, they hadn't crossed any lines. As for the male homosexuality rumors, she simply treated them as a joke, laughing it off. Melody Blackwood didn't deny having feelings for William Monroe, but that was all. Moreover, she was currently presenting as a man. Even if something were to happen, A distinguished figure like William Monroe surely wouldn't take notice of a mere illegitimate daughter. Otherwise, he wouldn't have deliberately avoided mentioning the incident in the forest that night. On this point, Melody Blackwood had a clear understanding. Some people were simply beyond her reach. The training of new recruits continued, and Melody Blackwood's daily duties expanded to include accompanying William Monroe on inspections of their progress. Having always been stationed within the cavalry camp, she hadn't known how the other camps trained their recruits. Now, after several days of observation, she discovered that these new recruits were essentially a disorganized rabble. The sergeants, in charge of the few recruits, displayed blatant favoritism and flattery. It was no wonder that the Yin army had suffered such a crushing defeat in the first battle. New recruits constituted nearly a quarter of the army, and with their presence, avoiding defeat would have been a miracle. Melody Blackwood couldn't help but worry. She wanted to share her thoughts with William Monroe, but seeing his confident demeanor, she swallowed her words. Perhaps he already had a winning strategy in mind. "Why are you frowning today?" William Monroe lifted the teacup from the table, took a sip, and gazed tenderly at Melody Blackwood, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "Nothing." Melody Blackwood shook her head, but her eyes betrayed her words. Darky had been refusing to eat or drink lately, seemingly ill. After summoning the groom and the army medic, they both concluded that he was in heat. However, with the impending war, horses were in high demand, and finding a suitable stallion for him to breed with was proving difficult. "It's because of Darky, isn't it?" William Monroe glanced at her, instantly seeing through her thoughts, his tone as gentle as a breeze, tinged with a hint of heartache. "If you had told me, I would have certainly helped you resolve it." Melody Blackwood stared at him, a flicker of surprise in her bright eyes. "You have a blood-sweating steed?" she asked. William Monroe nodded, his eyebrows raising slightly, a suggestive smile playing on his lips. Slowly rising from his chair, he moved closer to Melody Blackwood, leaning in to whisper in her ear. "If you want one, I can naturally procure it for you." William Monroe deliberately lowered his voice, his eyes gazing at her with amorous intent. Melody Blackwood's body stiffened. "General, please behave yourself," she said, taking a step back, but her footing was unsteady, causing her to stumble and fall. "Careful!" William Monroe exclaimed, quickly reaching out to catch her by the waist, his body bending slightly, his perfect features suddenly appearing before Melody Blackwood's eyes. Melody Blackwood's face flushed. The scene resembled a fairy tale encounter between a princess and a prince. Embarrassed, she turned her head away and quickly tried to stand, but stumbled again, this time towards the table. Melody Blackwood cried out, instinctively grabbing William Monroe's clothes. This time, they both fell onto the table. "Hey!" A shrill scream suddenly pierced the air outside the commander's tent. Startled, the two turned to see Lily Blackwood, dressed in green, screaming with her eyes closed. "William Monroe!" she shrieked, pointing at the two of them sprawled on the table, her face contorted with fury. William Monroe calmly rose from Melody Blackwood, pulling her up and straightening her slightly disheveled clothes. Only then did he turn, his usual smile in place. "I wonder what brings the princess here?" he asked, his expression as if nothing had happened. Lily Blackwood gritted her teeth and strode towards Melody Blackwood, assessing her from head to toe. Melody Blackwood's heart pounded, fearing that Lily Blackwood had recognized her. She inwardly panicked, but when Lily didn't call her name after a long moment, she breathed a sigh of relief. "Is this the pretty boy everyone's gossiping about?" Lily Blackwood asked shrilly. She had heard from her spies that William Monroe had a penchant for sodomy, and was involved with Melody Blackwood's personal guard within the barracks. Initially, Lily Blackwood hadn't quite believed it. This time, she came to see for herself. And she had certainly seen something. "Princess, my name is Melody Blackwood," Melody Blackwood replied, exasperated. At this point, she was certain that she and Lily Blackwood were fated to clash. No matter what identity she assumed, they would meet, and it would always result in a fierce confrontation. "Melody Blackwood?" Lily Blackwood questioned, then sneered. "With your rustic appearance, you're not even as good as that lowly wench." Clearly, she had misheard Melody Blackwood as Melody Blackwood. Melody Blackwood's lips twitched. The words, lowly wench, stung, but she suppressed her anger, taking a deep breath and pretending not to hear. Her current identity wouldn't allow her to retaliate for such an insult. "William Monroe, tell me the truth today. Is all of this true?" Lily Blackwood glared, her face ferocious, her teeth gritted as she stared at Melody Blackwood, as if she wanted to tear her to shreds. "What is the princess talking about?" William Monroe smiled faintly, feigning ignorance. Lily Blackwood took a deep breath. "I'm telling you, I'm very likely to be your future wife. You can't have a penchant for sodomy." Her expression became fiercer as she spoke, staring hatefully at Melody Blackwood, her tone domineering, clearly accustomed to having her way as a lady. William Monroe sneered inwardly, looking at Lily Blackwood opposite him, his eyes showing pity. "The princess shouldn't talk nonsense." "Marry her?" He'd rather genuinely prefer men. Melody Blackwood felt a bit of schadenfreude, looking at William Monroe with amusement. She had experienced Lily Blackwood's disruptive behavior every day, and now he had a chance to taste it too. Let him understand what it's like to be a commoner. William Monroe seemed to sense Melody Blackwood's gaze, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Turning to look at her, his eyes suddenly became tender. "In this lifetime, I only need Melody Blackwood." He spoke, his gentle tone causing Melody Blackwood's heart to beat faster, her face involuntarily flushing. At this moment, Melody Blackwood was like a young girl newly in love, her heart pounding. She looked up shyly at William Monroe, whispering coquettishly, "Hateful." William Monroe walked to her side, rubbing his nose against hers, and putting his arm around her waist. "What's wrong? Are you shy?" Melody Blackwood let out another coquettish whisper, her eyes glancing intentionally at Lily Blackwood, who was standing opposite them. As she expected, Lily Blackwood's eyes now held enough fury to incinerate someone. William Monroe chuckled, as if just remembering there was someone else beside him. He turned to look at Lily Blackwood, speaking casually. "Oh right, does the princess have anything else? You too?" Lily Blackwood was so angry that she pointed at them, about to say something but choked on her words. Her eyes landed on William Monroe's hand around Melody Blackwood's waist. Stamping her foot and letting out an "Ay!" she turned and left the commander's tent. As the tent flap opened, the soldiers who had been peeking immediately pretended to patrol or pass by, acting as if nothing had happened before dispersing. But their eyes still glanced inside, intentionally or unintentionally. Seeing Lily Blackwood storm off, Melody Blackwood couldn't help but burst into laughter, the smug look of a villain on her face. William Monroe suddenly moved closer, their eyes meeting. The adoration in his eyes sent an unexpected shiver down Melody Blackwood's spine. "You, Melody Blackwood hadn't finished speaking before something soft blocked her words. Her bright eyes widened in surprise as she looked at William Monroe in front of her, but he had closed his eyes, completely immersed. Melody Blackwood's heartbeat quickened again, that feeling of fluttering returning. If William Monroe that night was a wild beast, then at this moment he was like a holy angel. This long kiss made her involuntarily want to sink into it. Her wide eyes finally closed, their two burning hearts gradually drawing closer. Melody Blackwood felt that this must be a dream. She was a strong woman of the 21st century, a big sister who had rolled around in the underworld for decades. Yet now she couldn't believe she was conquered by a younger man with just a kiss. If this were before, speaking out would have been met with disbelief. But now, this scene truly unfolds. A long while later, the suffocating sensation pulled the two of them out of their immersion, slowly opening their eyes, their lips reluctantly parting. Melody Blackwood lowered her head, her gaze continuously sweeping across the smooth ground. She felt that she must have gone mad. "You?" she began, raising her head to look directly at William Monroe, wanting to say something but not knowing how to start. "This is the duty of a guard." William Monroe averted his gaze, intending to explain, but not knowing how, so he attributed it all to duty. As soon as the words left his mouth, Melody Blackwood's expression suddenly changed. The slight shyness on her face instantly returning to normal, she laughed self-deprecatingly, lowering her head and saying, "This humble servant understands. It turns out, I was overthinking." Melody Blackwood laughed coldly in her heart. If it were sincere, then why wouldn't he clarify what happened that night? "I'm going to see Darky." Melody Blackwood spoke, not waiting for William Monroe's reply, turning and walking out of the command tent. William Monroe only felt a sudden emptiness in his heart, his mind involuntarily recalling the scene that night in the forest. A long while later he sighed, shaking his head and sitting down on the chair. At this moment, even he himself didn't understand clearly the person he yearned for. Was it the mysterious woman he had a passionate night with? Or was it the seventh miss of the Marquis household, Melody Blackwood, before his eyes? Of course, in William Monroe's heart, he still leaned more towards that little guard. But he couldn't be an irresponsible man. Therefore, he himself fell into a dilemma. But in any case, with Lily Blackwood causing such a commotion in the military camp, the matter of him having male homosexuality was considered confirmed. For William Monroe, this was also considered a good thing. At least that little devil Lily Blackwood wouldn't pester him anymore, and his ears would be much quieter in the future. But after that incident, Melody Blackwood began to intentionally and unintentionally distance herself from William Monroe, the two always keeping a distance. Most of the time, Melody Blackwood preferred to take care of her beloved Darky rather than serve this great general. William Monroe always felt an emptiness in his heart, lacking something. It's just that military affairs were busy, and he could only put this matter aside. Perhaps after a while, she would no longer be angry. The flames of war rose again, the warhorses neighed incessantly, and the atmosphere of the entire camp became tense once more. The enemy finally couldn't hold back any longer and came to provoke them. Yin Kingdom couldn't continue to fly the flag of truce like this. In just a few short days, the strength of the entire army hadn't increased much, so William Monroe could only grit his teeth and accept the battle. Melody Blackwood remained in the military camp. She and William Monroe argued for a long time, but in the end, she couldn't sway him and could only comply with his wishes. However, having said that, Melody Blackwood not participating in the battle didn't mean she couldn't observe it. The reddish-brown warhorse raised its head and neighed. Melody Blackwood, clad in armor, sat atop it, her eyes bright as she looked towards the front where the soldiers were fighting, momentarily feeling her blood boil. A smile played on her lips as she patted her beloved Darky, bending down to whisper to it for a while. Darky, understanding her intent, whinnied a few times, a defiant glint in his eyes. "It's over! Everlasting Happiness Fortress has fallen!" Someone shouted, and the Yin Kingdom soldiers, who had been fighting fiercely, suddenly scattered like rats, abandoning their helmets and armor as they fled towards the camp. "Tranquil City has fallen too!" The same voice rang out again. In the military camp, Melody Blackwood's heart sank. She stared blankly at the disintegrating ranks, a wave of grief washing over her. As expected, we've lost. She didn't know whether to be pleased with her foresight or saddened by William Monroe's arrogance. "Loyal friend City has fallen!" Another wave crashed down. The voice echoed a third time. "Hold the line!" William Monroe roared, his spear lunging forward, impaling an enemy soldier. Blood splattered, but he ignored it, his face grim as he led his cavalry to defend the camp. There were only 3 fortresses, and in this short span of time, all had been captured. On the other side, the enemy's morale soared as they pressed the Yin Kingdom troops. Their leading general laughed, his blade rising and falling, each life extinguished as easily as harvesting wheat. Melody Blackwood frowned slightly, a flicker of pity in her eyes. This callous disregard for human life was something she hadn't witnessed in a long time. Even in her past life, she'd only experienced a similar situation once. The sheer brutality of war was truly appalling. It was no wonder everyone yearned for peace. "Melody Blackwood, go back!" William Monroe spotted her standing guard outside the camp. His gaze darkened, resentment and killing intent intensifying. Melody Blackwood calmly shook her head, drawing the sword at her hip. "As a child of the Yin Kingdom, I cannot flee in the face of danger." Her voice resonated with strength and conviction. Her words seemed to rally the crumbling morale of the troops. Melody Blackwood, noticing this effect, pressed on. She had hoped her words would inspire, but hadn't expected such a powerful response. "Who among us can escape death? Let our loyal hearts shine brightly. The children of the Yin Kingdom would rather die on their feet than live on their knees." She poured fuel on the fire, her gaze sweeping across the soldiers. William Monroe, who had intended to send her away, found himself filled with a renewed sense of hope. "Yes, Melody Blackwood is right." Lewis Lane was the first to echo her sentiment, raising his axe high. "The men of the Yin Kingdom would rather die standing than live kneeling. Brothers, let us fight to the death against the dogs of the Kingdom of Chi and the Kingdom of Zenith." Chapter 29. A Gamble, Overestimating Oneself. Fight to the death. Fight to the death. Fight to the death. The chant rippled through the ranks, a powerful wave of sound. Melody Blackwood nodded in satisfaction. Ignoring the gazes of the other generals, she mounted Darky and rode to meet the advancing enemy forces. The other soldiers, their morale reignited, followed after her, the chant of "Fight to the death" echoing from their lips. This sudden shift in momentum caught the enemy off guard. Their general signaled a halt to the pursuit. He sat upon his horse, his eyes narrowed as he assessed Melody Blackwood. "General, should we retreat?" The lieutenant spoke up, also looking at Melody Blackwood, frowning, feeling a chill down his spine. "Just a milk-smelling brat. I'll go meet him." Clearly, the Grand General didn't take Melody Blackwood seriously, and with Melody Blackwood only wearing the armor of a close-quarters guard, he had every reason to believe this was a bluff. "Be careful, General." The lieutenant was still worried, but seeing that the Grand General had already gone, he couldn't stop him. Melody Blackwood smirked, signaling Darky to stop, and glanced appraisingly at the enemy general. Bottomless eyes, a centipede-like scar crawled across his left cheek, looking terrifying. His whole body exuded a murderous aura, clearly accumulated from years of killing. The great sword in his hand, under the sunlight, shone brightly, mixed with fresh blood, reflecting onto Melody Blackwood's face. "Little whippersnapper, don't overestimate yourself. Surrender obediently, and I will spare your life." The general laughed loudly, his rough voice carrying a hint of weariness. William Monroe's pupils suddenly constricted in the distance, and he spurred his horse towards Melody Blackwood. "What are you doing?" he shouted anxiously, reaching out to pull her back. "Let me." Melody Blackwood shook her head, smiled faintly, and looked towards the enemy army, her eyes revealing her usual arrogance. Her lips parted slightly. "How about a wager?" Upon hearing this, the general immediately became interested, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Speak, child." The call of "child" clearly showed his disdain for Melody Blackwood. But Melody Blackwood didn't mind, who was stronger would be determined by the outcome. She smiled, a faint smirk playing on her lips. General, how many moves do you think it will take you to defeat me? The general paused, then regained his composure, assessing Melody Blackwood and the skinny horse beneath her. He shook his head. 5 moves at most. This was still his worst-case scenario estimation. Based on his lifetime of battle experience, it was easy to see that Melody Blackwood had never truly been on a battlefield. However, a faint air of ruthlessness around her gave a chilling feeling. All right. Melody Blackwood laughed arrogantly. I bet you can't knock me off my horse in 10 moves. She raised an eyebrow, her face full of confidence. Little whippersnapper, don't boast and eat your words. The Grand General, as if he had heard a joke, threw his head back and laughed for a long time. William Monroe also showed worry and indignation. Melody, what are you doing? He reproached in a low voice, clearly also thinking Melody Blackwood was boasting. He had previously fought with the enemy general, but William Monroe's strength was slightly inferior, and he had been at a disadvantage several times. However, he could still hold the general back. Humph, my brother Melody Blackwood has never lost a battle. Louis Lane, in the same posture as Melody Blackwood, raised his head with a confident look. However, this time, no other soldiers echoed him. Everyone knew that Louis Lane was always foolish, while William Monroe was worried about Melody Blackwood. Those who had been full of confidence just moments before now wilted like frostbitten aubergines. Melody Blackwood glared at William Monroe, whispering, See, why has morale shifted so drastically? Think it over carefully. You're a general, yet you don't even know the most basic principles of warfare. She didn't hold back, scolding William Monroe fiercely. William Monroe wasn't angry, furrowing his brow as he considered Melody Blackwood's words. Seeing William Monroe had quieted down, Melody Blackwood turned to face the opposing general. So do you dare to wager? The general let out a hearty laugh. Why wouldn't I dare? But what does the little one want to wager with me? If I win, you and I call a truce for 3 months to rest and recuperate. If I lose, then Yin Kingdom will cede 3 more cities to you. Melody Blackwood spoke with confidence and arrogance. It was unclear where she got such confidence and audacity to wager 3 cities of the Yin Kingdom. Ha, good. If you win, I'll not only call a truce with you for 3 months, but I'll also cede 1 city that I've already captured. The general readily agreed, but with a look of certain victory. However, as soon as these words were spoken, several generals behind the Yin Kingdom disagreed. After all, the stakes were too high. They couldn't afford to lose. General, don't. General Lewis was the first to voice his objection. I trust Melody Blackwood. William Monroe interrupted him. Whether it was Melody Blackwood's words that had enlightened him or not, he seemed to have regained his confidence in her, urging his horse back a few steps to stop beside Drake Mortimer. I trust her. Drake Mortimer smiled, his eyes never leaving her small figure. Me too. Ethan Mortimer, beside him, also spoke, his cold face bloodied. William Monroe smiled. Although he didn't speak, his meaning was clear. The general is indeed magnanimous. Gaining an additional city, Melody Blackwood naturally wouldn't refuse. Glancing at the man opposite her, she suddenly sheathed her long sword. Little one, what are you doing? The general asked, puzzled. Melody Blackwood laughed confidently and arrogantly. Since you're the one attacking, this weapon is useless to me. Within 10 moves, as long as I remain on my horse, I win. Clearly, Melody Blackwood meant that no matter how he attacked, she wouldn't retaliate. You overestimate yourself. The general, for the first time, was underestimated by such a young person, and he felt quite displeased. Watch out. He gave a warning. The great sword in his hand swung, condensing into a dazzling azure glow from the tip of the blade, striking straight towards Melody Blackwood. A confident smile appeared on his weathered face, as if he had already seen the scene of Melody Blackwood being knocked off her horse in a miserable state. However, something unexpected happened. Melody Blackwood's hands moved continuously, a gale suddenly forming beneath her palms. In an instant, the surroundings became filled with flying dust and stones. Darky beneath her neighed, and Melody Blackwood patted it gently to soothe it. "Go!" Melody Blackwood shouted. Dust and stones flew chaotically, rushing towards the brilliant azure glow. Boom! The loud noise made the ground tremble. Dust and debris completely enveloped azure glow. After a long while, when the dust settled, azure glow had vanished without a trace. What sort of martial art is this? In an instant, the onlookers began to murmur amongst themselves. The technique Melody Blackwood displayed was simply too earth-shattering. To the extent that, for a moment, these people simply couldn't comprehend it. William Monroe's expression shifted continuously, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and delight as he looked at Melody Blackwood. He was certain this woman was absolutely not as simple as she appeared. The enemy army clearly hadn't expected Melody Blackwood, who appeared so delicate, to be capable of such a powerful counterattack. The great general laughed heartily, praising her repeatedly, his gaze towards Melody Blackwood carrying a newfound gravity. He also realized that this Melody Blackwood was not someone to be trifled with. "General, please continue." Melody Blackwood waved her hand, smiling at the man opposite her, her words still as arrogant as before. "It seems I underestimated you." The great general honestly admitted the truth. Everyone present, with the exception of Louis Lane, believed that Melody Blackwood would undoubtedly be defeated. "Receive my second attack?" This time, he didn't refer to Melody Blackwood as a child. The blade in his hand flashed with a blinding light, a sharp aura emanating from him. Melody Blackwood, facing him, curled her lips into a faint smile. Sitting upright on her horse's back, she remained motionless. Everyone was stunned, looking at each other and then back again. The blade had vanished. Boom! A loud explosion suddenly erupted from behind them. Everyone turned their heads simultaneously, only to see a large tree crashing down, its newly sprouted leaves scattering across the ground. Darky neighed triumphantly, its gaze as haughty as Melody Blackwood's. No one saw how Melody Blackwood had evaded the attack, only that if it were them, it was highly likely that what would have fallen wouldn't be the tree, but themselves. "Ha ha ha ha!" The great general roared with laughter. "A true hero emerges from youth. The general is too kind." Melody Blackwood replied, her expression natural. "All officers and soldiers of the kingdom of Qi, listen to my command. Withdraw from Tranquil City and cease fighting for 3 months." He bellowed, his voice causing everyone's heads to ring. "General, no!" As soon as these words were spoken, naturally, there was dissent. "I, Michael Owens, am a man of my word." This general was indeed a man of integrity. After only 2 exchanges with Melody Blackwood, he willingly admitted defeat and fulfilled his promise. "The great general is truly forthright. I, Melody Blackwood, accept." In this situation, she naturally wouldn't refuse. Since he had conceded, Melody Blackwood readily accepted. Having already lost 3 cities, thanks to Melody Blackwood's intervention, 1 was recovered, but 2 still remained in enemy hands. In this second conflict, the Yin Kingdom was once again defeated. However, those who constantly spoke ill of Melody Blackwood and William Monroe became significantly fewer. They all had reason to believe that Melody Blackwood was a rare expert. However, the record of 2 consecutive defeats was still reported to the Emperor of the Yin Kingdom, Henry Monroe. As for the matter of Melody Blackwood valiantly repelling the enemy's great general, it was quietly suppressed by William Monroe. Those who knew of it were only those present that day, and those people were all silenced by William Monroe. The royal court. Henry Monroe, his face pale, looked down at the assembled civil and military officials below. The atmosphere was so tense, it was almost palpable, everyone seemingly afraid that the slightest misstep would incur the wrath of the man on the dragon throne. "Are you all planning to remain silent like this? Or are you waiting for me to dismiss court, so you can all go home and dine?" Henry Monroe's gloomy voice echoed, his displeasure evident. "We are remiss, Your Majesty." The officials simultaneously knelt, reciting the familiar phrase in unison. "Humph!" Henry Monroe, clearly tired of this routine, retorted. "Prince Xiang just reported back. 2 battles, 2 crushing defeats. The enemy has seized 2 of our Yen Kingdom cities. Instead of devising solutions, you're here displaying your remissness. We are worthy of death, Your Majesty." The officials repeated their age-old refrain, trembling as they prostrated themselves, clearly lacking any viable strategy. Henry Monroe's lips trembled with fury. After a long moment, he simply flicked his sleeve and departed. "Your Majesty." Lily Blackwood, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward and knelt. "Lily implores Your Majesty to grant her permission to go to war and slay the enemy." Henry Monroe paused, his gaze falling upon the green-clad figure before him. Then he offered a conciliatory smile. "Lily, your loyalty is commendable. However, the battlefield is no game. Lives are lost in the blink of an eye." Lily Blackwood shook her head, her expression resolute. "I have trained in mystical arts since childhood, preparing for the day I could serve my country. Now that the Yin Kingdom is in peril, I will not shirk my duty. I vow to defend our land." Her words stirred the entire court. No one expected such a declaration from such a young girl. In an instant, all eyes turned towards Lily Blackwood and Arthur Blackwood. Some admired Arthur Blackwood for raising such a fine daughter, others were envious. Some agreed with her sentiment, others respected her resolve, and some mocked her naivete. A full spectrum of human emotions played across their faces. "Excellent, excellent, excellent!" Henry Monroe threw back his head and laughed, nodding at her. "I appoint you vanguard, to assist Prince Xiang. Depart immediately and strive to defeat the enemy." Lily Blackwood smiled, her bearing that of a true heroine. "Lily Blackwood thanks Your Majesty. There's no need for such formalities, Vanguard," Henry Monroe replied. News of Lily Blackwood's appointment as Vanguard quickly reached the military camp. Within the command tent, William Monroe sat gloomily in the commander's chair, staring down at a map with a vexed expression. "What's wrong?" Melody Blackwood's voice, laced with a hint of sarcasm, came from behind him. "Your betrothed is coming to fight alongside you, and you're not happy?" William Monroe glanced up at her. "Do you not know what kind of person your sister is? If she comes, the Yin Kingdom will be ruined in less than 3 months. I don't know if father has gone senile, sending her here." Never mind her harassment of the populace and her unruly temper. Just her constant clinging alone is enough to drive anyone mad. Melody Blackwood chuckled, patting William Monroe on the shoulder. "You're on your own." She was ready for a good show. Lily Blackwood was truly unpopular. As soon as news of her appointment spread, groans of discontent rippled through the camp. William Monroe glanced at her. "Do you think you'll have a good day?" His tone was like that of a resentful, secluded woman. "Don't forget what she saw that day." Hearing him say this, Melody Blackwood remembered. That day, Lily Blackwood had misunderstood, thinking she and William Monroe were engaged in homosexual activity, and ran away. Now, she was actively volunteering for battle. It certainly wasn't as simple as she claimed, wanting to defend the realm. Most likely, she still had feelings for William Monroe. "Wait for her to arrive. Let her fight a battle. We won't interfere." When the time comes, let her taste a bit of hardship, and she'll naturally return. After thinking for a moment, Melody Blackwood came up with this inferior strategy. But doing so would be breaking faith with the enemy. She had just established a 3-month truce with them. Isn't this a bit dodgy? Clearly, William Monroe was also considering this point. Melody Blackwood gave him a mysterious smile, raising an eyebrow. You are the Grand General. Eh? William Monroe looked at Melody Blackwood quizzically. Don't attack. Have our vanguard lead 50,000 troops to spar with their vanguard and their 50,000 troops. Seeing as their general is also victory-hungry, she'll certainly agree. Melody Blackwood's tone suggested she was certain of the other side's agreement. As for the outcome, win or lose, I don't know. But we must ensure Lily Blackwood's safety. She's just a young girl. If she loses, she'll certainly panic. Melody Blackwood added as a final note. William Monroe looked at her with a surprised expression, as if trying to discover something from her. But after looking for a long time, he found nothing. She was still as ordinary and frail as ever. Don't look if you shouldn't. Melody Blackwood acted coy, her small face involuntarily flushing red. No matter how calm she was, in front of William Monroe, she would always become flustered, turning into a little woman. Of course, William Monroe was very pleased to see this appearance. He smiled gently at her, and was about to speak when he saw the pavilion curtain being slowly drawn back. Drake Mortimer entered, leading the person no one wanted to see. Lily Blackwood had changed out of her green clothes. She wore a meticulously chosen set of dark red armor, her hair neatly tied back, looking somewhat handsome. William Monroe instinctively compared Lily Blackwood dressed like this to Melody Blackwood, shaking his head at Lily Blackwood after a moment. Clearly, he still preferred the way Melody Blackwood looked. Brother Keem. That sickeningly sweet voice again. William Monroe couldn't help but shudder, his scalp tingling. But outwardly, he maintained a composed demeanor, hands clasped behind his back, nodding faintly at Lily Blackwood. You've arrived, he said. Lily Blackwood's face flushed red for some reason. She took small steps to William Monroe's side, her arm intentionally or unintentionally pushing Melody Blackwood aside. I missed you so much. She lowered her head and wrapped her arm around William Monroe's. William Monroe's body suddenly stiffened. His eyes darted towards the other two people in the general's tent, seeking help. Drake Mortimer pretended not to see, walking over to Melody Blackwood and whispering something to her. Melody Blackwood simply shrugged at him, showing a helpless expression. Brother Keem, I'm your vanguard now. When the time comes, we'll fight the enemy together. You must protect me. Lily Blackwood, completely oblivious to William Monroe's discomfort, looked up at him with an expression she thought was adorable. Chapter 30. Lily Blackwood's capture. William Monroe forced a strained smile, pulling his arm from her clutches and stepping back. You're tired, he said. I've had the Shadow Guard prepare your quarters. Rest first. Our troops and the enemy will clash in a few days. Get a good rest, as your performance then will be crucial. Lily Blackwood nodded, offering a sweet, obedient smile as her eyes, blinking frequently, remained fixed on William Monroe's face. The vanguard should rest. Our general has military matters to attend to. Melody Blackwood interjected, unable to bear Lily Blackwood's nauseating display any longer. But those words hit a nerve. Lily Blackwood's face changed instantly. Turning, she pointed at Melody Blackwood, her haughty nature flaring. Who are you? She shrieked. To interrupt my conversation with my dearest Keem? Melody Blackwood sighed inwardly. Their personalities clashed like fire and ice. General, look at her, she complained to William Monroe, her expression a picture of wronged innocence. William Monroe's male homosexuality was well established, So Melody Blackwood's coquettish behavior didn't surprise Lily Blackwood. It only fueled the fire within her. Her wide eyes remained locked on William Monroe, waiting for his response.
There, there,
William Monroe soothed, stroking Melody Blackwood's hair with a tender expression.
She is, after all, the vanguard.
Somehow, despite both being Blackwoods, their coquetry felt distinctly different. Melody Blackwood nodded obediently, standing silently beside William Monroe. This only intensified Lily Blackwood's fury.
Vanguard, there's no need for this,
Drake Mortimer interjected smoothly.
Perhaps I should escort you to your quarters.
He knew that if Lily Blackwood remained, the camp would be thrown into utter chaos.
Humph.
Lily Blackwood glared at the two, their affectionate exchange making her stomach churn. With a cold snort, she flicked her sleeves and stormed off. Finally, Drake Mortimer turned back, giving William Monroe a knowing smile. William Monroe breathed a sigh of relief.
We've finally sent that deity on her way.
Melody Blackwood chuckled softly.
It's hard to say what the future holds.
At her words, a shiver ran down William Monroe's spine. He frowned.
We must contact the enemy quickly and get rid of her soon.
William Monroe's words weren't idle. That very day, Melody Blackwood sent a message to the enemy. Their general readily agreed, setting the date for 3 days later. Of course, only a few knew the machinations at play. Lily Blackwood remained blissfully unaware. Upon hearing of the impending battle, she was thrilled. William Monroe, generously, granted her 50,000 troops for her personal command, forbidding any interference from others. This played perfectly into Lily Blackwood's hands. She boasted confidently of her inevitable victory, envisioning the Emperor rewarding her with William Monroe's hand in marriage. Her plan was indeed cunning, flawed only by her overwhelming arrogance. She utterly underestimated the enemy. The 50,000 troops under her command seethed with resentment, filling the camp with discontent. But Lily Blackwood remained oblivious, surrounded by sycophants who fueled her ego. Wherever she went, she strutted about arrogantly. Though the soldiers were disgruntled, General William Monroe remained silent, so they had to endure it. Melody Blackwood wore an expression of anticipation, waiting for the spectacle to unfold, for Lily Blackwood's inevitable defeat and departure. Knowing Lily Blackwood as she did, Melody was certain this would happen. The next day, as dawn broke, Lily Blackwood enthusiastically set off with 50,000 troops. William Monroe stood outside the command tent, frowning, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Melody Blackwood emerged from within and stood beside him, a slight smirk playing on her lips.
What's wrong?
She teased.
Worried about your little wifey?
She nudged his sleeve with her hand. William Monroe pursed his lips.
Little wifey. Hardly,
he retorted, though a flicker of concern did indeed cross his eyes.
Regardless, she's the Marquis's treasure. If anything untoward happens, I fear even my father, the king, will have difficulty explaining it.
His words held truth. As irritating as Lily Blackwood was, her status was undeniable. Any harm to her would undoubtedly cause widespread displeasure.
Follow her discreetly and ensure her safety. It's supposed to be a practice exercise, so the enemy shouldn't give her too much trouble,
Melody Blackwood said. However, considering Lily Blackwood's boastful and provocative nature, she added,
but if she provokes them with her arrogance, she'll be in great danger. Let her reap what she sows.
Having lived with Lily Blackwood for so long, Melody knew her true colors better than anyone. Despite her words, a sliver of worry lingered. Lily Blackwood's usual bullying was confined to the household, where retaliation was unlikely. But the battlefield was different. The slightest displeasure could mean life or death, a constant struggle for survival.
You should still protect her discreetly. Don't let anything unexpected happen. If she ends up crippled and clinging to you for life, you'll never have a moment's peace. Despite everything, they were both members of the Blackwood family, with no deep-seated hatred between them. Melody Blackwood saw no need to be overly concerned. With a casual wave, she patted William Monroe's shoulder. William Monroe stared at Melody Blackwood, a sly grin spreading across his face. "What's this about? Are you concerned for her, or for me?" He removed her hand from his shoulder, his eyebrows raised in a roguish smile. Melody Blackwood shot him a sideways glance, about to retort, when she felt a wave of unusual stares directed at them. A group of soldiers were looking their way, expressions of disdain and exasperation in their eyes. Flustered, Melody Blackwood withdrew her hand and glared at him. "Unhand me, you scoundrel!" William Monroe simply shrugged, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "Humph!" A cold snort came from above them. Both of them quickly looked up to see Lily Blackwood mounted on her warhorse, her battle robes billowing in the wind. She held her usual riding crop, looking down at Melody Blackwood with an air of haughty defiance. Melody Blackwood pointedly looked away, pretending not to see her. Seeing Melody Blackwood's lack of response, she turned to William Monroe, her eyes instantly transforming into pools of clear water. Blinking, she spoke in a saccharine voice. "Dear Brother Keem, I must leave now. Won't you see me off?" William Monroe suppressed the nausea rising in his stomach and forced a smile. "Let's go," he said, taking Lily Blackwood's horse by the reins and leading it towards the edge of the camp. Melody Blackwood chuckled inwardly, silently offering a prayer for William Monroe's misfortune. Suddenly Lily Blackwood's horse let out a frightened neigh, lost control, and reared up, attempting to bolt. Startled, Melody Blackwood turned to see the pair passing her precious darky's stable. William Monroe tried to restrain the panicked horse, but his strength was insufficient. He couldn't hold it back, and Lily Blackwood screamed from atop the rearing animal. The horse was just startled. "You two should go. The enemy is approaching," Melody Blackwood said, ignoring Lily Blackwood's furious glare, feigning nonchalance as she waved them away. "Let's go," William Monroe said calmly, looking at Lily Blackwood. Seeing both of them acting as if nothing had happened, Lily Blackwood had no choice but to comply. Taking a deep breath, she glared at Melody Blackwood before turning her horse and riding away. Behind her, Melody Blackwood's triumphant laughter echoed as she patted Darky and gave him a thumbs up. Lily Blackwood's humiliation filled her with immense satisfaction. William Monroe escorted Lily Blackwood out of the camp and then left. Once she was some distance away, he and Drake Mortimer stealthily followed, acting as her unseen protectors. The enemy's 50,000 troops had arrived first, but this time, the Grand General wasn't present. The Deputy General from the previous encounter was leading the charge. Lily Blackwood maintained her usual arrogance, as if she truly reigned supreme over all creation. The enemy's Deputy General hadn't expected to face a woman, and a beautiful one at that. He narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing Lily Blackwood before nodding thoughtfully, a subtle glint in his eyes. Lily Blackwood, naturally, failed to notice this subtle shift in his demeanor. She brandished her whip, demanding a fight to the death. The 50,000-strong army roared their approval. Lily Blackwood, head held high, looked down at the Deputy General. "Surrender, and I'll spare your life." The Deputy General chuckled, as if she told a particularly amusing joke. He twirled his pike, an aura of battle intent radiating from him. His sharp gaze fixed on Lily Blackwood's face, making her heart pound. She looked up at him, startled, clearly intimidated by his presence. You mustn't force my hand," Lily Blackwood stammered, her bravado fading. She swung her riding crop, but hesitated to strike. "Humph," he scoffed, an eyebrow arching. "Are you jesting with me?" He clearly didn't consider Lily Blackwood a threat. Casually, he lowered his pike, offering her a mocking smile. Then, with a sudden leap, He closed the distance between them. Lily Blackwood stared, stunned, as he approached. Before she could react, she felt a hand on her hip. That wrathful face drew near, right before her eyes. "Ah!" she cried out in terror, finally reacting, but she had already fallen into enemy hands. Observing from afar, William Monroe immediately sensed something was amiss. Exchanging a glance with Drake Mortimer, they nodded and revealed themselves. "Release her!" William Monroe, pike in hand, confronted the enemy lieutenant, his face grim. "Weren't the Grand General supposed to stay out of this? What's the meaning of your presence here?" The lieutenant raised an eyebrow, his right arm around Lily Blackwood's waist, a half-mocking smile in his eyes, as he met William's gaze. William Monroe was momentarily speechless, his rising momentum instantly dissipated. "Then I'll step in. I am a lieutenant, after all." Drake Mortimer emerged from behind William Monroe, offering him a smile, his usual nonchalant demeanor unwavering. "You Unions are quite amusing. The Grand General's presence is a violation of the rules. This woman, I'm taking her. We'll meet again." The lieutenant laughed, and without waiting for a response, he leaped, carrying Lily Blackwood and vanishing before their eyes in a blink. Lily Blackwood's piercing scream echoed through the air, lingering for a long time. "Pursue him!" William Monroe roared, spurring his horse after the lieutenant's vanishing form. Yet, as if prearranged, the 50,000 troops remained motionless, not budging an inch. William Monroe stopped in astonishment, turning to look at the men, only to see them chatting and laughing as they walked away. He looked blankly at Drake Mortimer, who also wore an expression of helplessness and confusion. One could only imagine how deeply Lily Blackwood had alienated the troops. Her capture now carried a certain karmic irony. Melody Blackwood, evidently unaware of the events unfolding at the front, stood beside Darky, affectionately petting it while contemplating how to reclaim the two cities once Lily Blackwood was gone. Suddenly, a clamor reached her ears from afar. Looking up, she saw soldiers approaching, their laughter and chatter echoing. Seeing Melody Blackwood watching them, each soldier waved. Melody Blackwood's previous rout of the enemy had clearly left a deep impression. Now, as long as Melody Blackwood wasn't with William Monroe, she was sure to be treated with respect by the soldiers. However, judging by their demeanor, it was clear, without a doubt, that Lily Blackwood had prevailed. With that thought, her spirits lifted, and she rode Darky out of the camp. Yet, William Monroe and Drake Mortimer were approaching with grim expressions, and Lily Blackwood was nowhere to be seen. "What happened?" Melody Blackwood asked. With a somber expression, William Monroe recounted the entire incident to Melody Blackwood, shaking his head after he finished. Melody Blackwood clearly hadn't expected events to unfold this way. Her brow furrowed slightly, a look of worry on her face. Given Lily Blackwood's temperament, being captured by the enemy wouldn't bode well. Moreover, she was quite attractive, and in a camp devoid of women for years, she might be subjected to humiliation, her innocence lost. "We should report this to father." The camp was rife with informants. News of Lily Blackwood's capture had caused such a commotion that if someone with malicious intent chose to speak, they wouldn't be able to suppress it. Currently, a 3-month truce is the only option to bolster our forces and crush the enemy's morale, allowing us to retrieve Lily Blackwood. "I fear it's not that simple." Melody Blackwood sensed a foreboding premonition, a lingering unease she couldn't shake. Lily Blackwood's capture seems more complex than it appears. "Return to the General's tent and discuss this." William Monroe's voice was grave as he strode towards the General's tent. Inside the General's tent, the atmosphere was frigid. William Monroe's face was grim as he surveyed the silent officers. Melody Blackwood stood silently, observing everyone, her eyes darting around, lost in thought. Drake Mortimer maintained his usual nonchalance, even managing a smile in this dire situation, much to William Monroe's chagrin.
How do we rescue the princess?
Lily Blackwood's status made her capture a delicate matter, potentially causing unrest. If Arthur Blackwood uses this to blackmail the Yin Kingdom into surrendering to the Kingdom of Qi or the Kingdom of Zenith, the consequences could be catastrophic. Lily Blackwood's safety is paramount. Yet, this makes action even more precarious, as one wrong move could jeopardize the entire nation.
We can only wait.
General Lewis sighed, his usual commanding presence diminished. Intellect outweighs brute force in this situation, but the camp lacks a strategist. William Monroe, though familiar with the Book of War, was overconfident, leading to 2 previous defeats. Now humbled, he recognized his limitations, leaving them in a quandary.
Melody Blackwood, what are your thoughts?
William Monroe turned to the silent Melody Blackwood, aware of her sharp intellect and formidable martial arts skills, both of which had surprised him. Recalling her duel with the enemy general, William Monroe felt a surge of excitement and gratitude that such a woman served the Yin Kingdom. Otherwise, their situation would be dire. Melody Blackwood gave a faint smile and shook her head at William Monroe.
I don't know.
With so many present in the general's tent, she wouldn't risk voicing her opinion and sparking a heated debate. Such matters were best discussed privately. William Monroe's face darkened at her response. The others exchanged knowing glances, their silence and subtle nods confirming their assumption of a male homosexuality between Melody Blackwood and William Monroe. It was a cruel irony for a woman of her standing to be in such a predicament.
Everyone stand down. They likely won't harm Lily Blackwood. We'll counterattack after the 3-month truce. Rescuing her then won't be too late.
William Monroe wearily waved his hand, dismissing everyone. Chapter 31. Enemy night raid. A long while later he sighed, closing his eyes, his brows furrowed tightly. He looked up at the top of the tent, his gaze vacant.
Don't worry, brother. Good things happen to good people.
Melody Blackwood consoled him. Lily Blackwood's situation worried her slightly. She only hoped her sister wouldn't cause trouble for the enemy. Melody Blackwood suddenly felt sorry for that deputy general. Of all the people to kidnap, he chose someone like her. She wondered if he was blind.
Is she a good person? If so, why would I be so worried?
William Monroe's gloomy voice echoed. Though slightly sulky, her words made sense.
Lily Blackwood isn't a good person, but she's formidable. Don't worry, brother. She's so good at bullying others. Do you think she'll suffer there?
Melody Blackwood's voice grew increasingly bitter, her gaze at William Monroe holding a hint of discontent. Lily Blackwood truly wasn't someone to worry about.
You're right,
William Monroe murmured, nodding, but his furrowed brows didn't relax. Instead, they deepened.
So what are you worried about?
Melody Blackwood asked.
Didn't you notice the soldiers' attitudes when they returned today?
William Monroe prompted. Hearing this, Melody Blackwood recalled their laughter and chatter upon their return. It had to be said, there was a serious problem with this army. After some thought, she decided to share her thoughts and perspectives with William Monroe. It might not have much effect, but it was her contribution nonetheless.
William Monroe, do you feel you've taken the wrong approach in training the army?
Intrigued by her words, William Monroe tilted his head and looked at Melody Blackwood, asking,
How so? Do you know why they enlisted?
She asked. This question stunned William Monroe.
To protect the country?
His questioning tone clearly indicated that even he didn't believe that was the reason. Indeed, Melody Blackwood reacted as if she'd heard a hilarious joke. She looked up into William Monroe's eyes, then shook her head after a moment.
Then what is it?
He genuinely couldn't think of a second reason, and he had led the army with this question lingering in his mind until now. Ultimately, the reason was simple. He was the current crown prince, naturally possessing the power of life and death. Of course, William Monroe joined the army to protect the country. After all, the throne of Yin Kingdom would one day be his. He was risking his life now for his own future.
Like your deeper motive.
Melody Blackwood seemed to see through his thoughts with a single glance, clasping her hands behind her back.
So what should we do?
This was what he most wanted to know. William Monroe looked at Melody Blackwood expectantly, awaiting her answer. Seeing his expression, Melody Blackwood couldn't help but chuckle a few times before turning and sitting on the main seat.
You know, it's not that the enemy is too strong, but our army fundamentally lacks a collective fighting spirit. Moreover, there are many nobles among the new recruits who don't genuinely intend to protect the country. So, when their lives are in danger, all they can do is flee and save themselves. Of course, you don't need to be angry. This is quite normal.
Melody Blackwood's words immediately pointed out the biggest problem the army was currently facing. Lack of unity, no matter how powerful or strong individuals were, was all for naught. In the end, even if the enemy only spat, they could drown them.
So what do you think we should do, Miss Blackwood?
William Monroe hastily asked, her words suddenly enlightening him, and at the same time, he understood why the 50,000 soldiers didn't go to rescue Lily Blackwood. It must have been to save their own lives.
You, first win the hearts of the soldiers, make them wholeheartedly loyal to you, and you'll be halfway there.
Melody Blackwood waved her hand, her face full of disdain. Clearly, William Monroe wasn't a good general at present. Seeing him still looking bewildered, Melody Blackwood continued,
You must remember, on the battlefield, individual strength is never the thing to compete with. Haven't you ever heard? Win the hearts of the people, and you win the world. Governing a country and leading an army have some similarities. You may not realize it now, but you will later.
Melody Blackwood put on the air of a learned scholar. She paced back and forth within the command tent. However, after speaking for a long time, she didn't hear a response from William Monroe. She looked at him questioningly and saw him frowning in thought.
Furthermore, your method of training new recruits is inadequate. If you continue like this, let alone killing the enemy could knock them down with a single stick.
Melody Blackwood finally voiced the words she had been holding back for a long time.
Huh?
William Monroe was stunned.
How could that be? Our Yin Kingdom has always trained new recruits this way.
He admitted his leadership was lacking, but he always felt there was nothing wrong with this training method. However, he also knew Melody Blackwood was no ordinary person. Since she said so, she must have her reasons. Thinking this, William Monroe said,
Tell me more, Miss Blackwood.
Seeing his relatively receptive attitude, Melody Blackwood nodded and told him about the flaws in his training methods. Training recruits and teaching were similar. While there was no distinction between classes in teaching, instruction should be tailored to each individual. Those with better abilities should be trained with higher intensity. If so, Melody Blackwood was confident she could train a qualified Special Forces unit. In her past life, to improve her own strength, Melody Blackwood had specifically gone to a Special Forces training facility for a period. Although it was arduous, the results were gratifying. Her overall strength had improved by leaps and bounds.
So, according to you, Miss Blackwood, how should we train our soldiers?
William Monroe asked. His eyes became calm again, as if he was digesting everything Melody Blackwood had said.
Listen to me, and I'll explain it to you slowly.
Melody Blackwood smiled and told William Monroe about the soldier training methods she had devised earlier. As the sky gradually darkened, the two within the command tent were still engrossed in discussing soldier training methods and how to train special forces. The soldiers, whether intentionally or not, squinted at the commander's tent, curiosity etched on their faces, clearly assuming Melody Blackwood and William Monroe were engaged in some clandestine activity within. A long while later, a hearty laugh erupted from within the tent. William Monroe boomed out the word, "Good," his excitement finally subsiding. He clapped Melody Blackwood on the shoulder and lowered his voice, saying, "It's a pity you're a gentleman in disguise, a true daughter. If you were a man, our Yin kingdom would undoubtedly be even stronger." His eyes filled with regret as he shook his head and sighed. Melody Blackwood shot him a sideways glance and murmured, "So now that I'm not a man, my words are all nonsense." It must be said, this ancient notion of prioritizing men over women has harmed countless individuals, burying who knows how many brilliant women. It's no wonder this army can't find a decent strategist. "How could that be? You are my esteemed strategist." William Monroe hastily chuckled, trying to smooth things over. "Then what if I appear in women's attire tomorrow?" Melody Blackwood said with a playful grin, deliberately teasing William Monroe. "That wouldn't be appropriate," William Monroe said, a troubled expression on his face. "There are only men here. Aren't you afraid something might happen? If I can't protect you, then—" "Fine, I won't change," Melody Blackwood interrupted impatiently, glaring at him before turning to walk towards the resting area behind. "Wake up early tomorrow and take me to implement the new plan. Remember, we only have 3 months. Melody Blackwood's voice drifted from behind, and a warmth spread through William Monroe's chest, a smile involuntarily playing on his lips. The next day, as dawn broke, the entire camp of soldiers awoke and stood in formation on the training grounds. William Monroe had stayed up all night explaining the new training methods to the generals, and they had unanimously agreed. Naturally, there could be no negligence in military campaigns. If the strength of the entire army could be enhanced, everyone would naturally support it. Clad in dark gold armor that shimmered faintly, William Monroe stood with his hands clasped behind his back before the dozen or so company commanders, his eyes glinting with a cold light. The thin man had already written out the training plan and distributed it to the commanders. The other soldiers had already begun their training. Melody Blackwood strolled among them, observing them from head to toe, occasionally nodding in approval. William Monroe's gaze rested on the slender figure, and a warmth bloomed in his chest. He smiled faintly, his eyes sweeping over everyone with an air of authority. The soldiers' movements faltered, and they straightened up, looking at William Monroe, awaiting his commands. William Monroe nodded in satisfaction, cleared his throat, and said, "From today onwards, all soldiers will train according to this method. If you can't persevere, leave early." With that, he gestured to the thin man with his eyes. The man immediately reacted, smiling at William Monroe before picking up the paper in his hand and reading aloud the training content written on it. "Wake up at the 5th bat of the hour of the tiger, run 50 laps around the training grounds with a Tianjin sandbag. Archery requires 3 arrows to hit the bullseye to be considered a pass." He read each point carefully, but the more he read, the more unsightly his expression became. During the copying process, he hadn't scrutinized it closely, and only now, after reading it through, did he realize that this training regimen was truly beyond the capabilities of ordinary individuals. Even more unsightly than his expression were the faces of the soldiers who had to participate in the training. They looked at each other, their faces etched with unease. Especially those whose initial motivations weren't pure, they now even contemplated withdrawing. However, such an opportunity wasn't available. After listening to the thin man read it out, William Monroe calmly nodded. "These are all targeted training exercises. If you feel you can't do it, you can leave at any time. But I believe the people of the Yin Kingdom aren't the type to admit defeat before even trying." His words, spoken with such grandeur, instantly stirred the emotions of those who had intended to withdraw. Each raised their weaponry high, shouting the 3 words, "Not giving up." William Monroe nodded in satisfaction, gave a few more instructions to the company commanders, and then led the other generals away. Melody Blackwood, however, stayed behind to observe the training situation. She intended to establish a special forces unit, but currently the barracks were overflowing with soldiers, making it difficult to distinguish the good from the bad. She could only wait and see, after implementing this new training method for a while, who would be suitable and who wouldn't. 3 months was indeed a very tight time frame, but Melody Blackwood also understood that elite soldiers weren't made overnight. Only through the tempering of time could one truly become strong. Just like her when she first arrived in this world, her body was so frail that she couldn't withstand a single blow, yet now she possessed a powerful burst of strength. Some things must undergo a quantitative accumulation before a qualitative change can occur. Currently, although many improvements have been made, there are still aspects that defy scientific principles. For now, we can only try an accelerated method and observe the results. If it's effective, we'll continue to refine and improve it. With that thought, Melody Blackwood had formed her own ideas and plans. After observing the training for a while, she turned and headed back towards the general's tent. Although the enemy had agreed to a 3-month ceasefire, Melody Blackwood always felt that if they had kidnapped Lily Blackwood, they certainly wouldn't remain silent. There was likely a larger conspiracy at play. Seeing Melody Blackwood return, William Monroe immediately went to greet her, a cheerful expression on his face, the very picture of springtime contentment. "The enemy is within 100 miles, and you can still be so cheerful?" Melody Blackwood glanced at him askance, her manner utterly devoid of any sense of hierarchical deference. But William Monroe didn't mind at all, smiling warmly at her. "With you in command, I have no worries, even if a large army is pressing down on us." "Smooth talker." Melody Blackwood feigned anger, but her eyes were full of amusement. Ignoring him further, she turned and entered the general's tent. William Monroe shrugged nonchalantly and followed her in. At this time, the soldiers were all in training, so no one witnessed this tender moment. However, even if they had seen it, they wouldn't have found it strange. It was just that they felt a slight pang of regret. After all, William Monroe's status was what it was. Night fell, and after completing the final training exercise, the soldiers lay wearily on their beds to rest. Patrols and guard duty were carried out in rotations. Having undergone such high-intensity training, they only wished to immediately fall into a deep, restful sleep. Thus, also sluggish and listless, with a lifeless appearance, the lantern in hand flickered, seemingly about to be extinguished by the slightest breeze. A dozen or so dark figures suddenly appeared in an orderly fashion. Leading them was a petite figure. Holding a long whip, with eyes peering out, the figure stared intently at the general's tent. Silently turning, the figure waved to the dark figures behind, directing their movements. Seeing the dark figures nod in response, the figure bent down and moved towards the general's tent. "Seize them!" A voice suddenly rang out in the air, as flames erupted, blazing fiercely. Figures clad in black appeared, surrounding the dark-clad individuals. The steps of the dark figures faltered, quickly retreating towards their own side. Anxiety and reproach were evident in their exposed eyes. The small figure clearly hadn't anticipated this turn of events. With a tense expression, the figure hid behind the others, but was shoved forward to the front by the others, who cast the figure off with disdain. "You arrive uninvited. Where do you think you're going?" William Monroe's voice resonated softly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Melody Blackwood stood beside him, assessing the uninvited guests. She offered a cryptic smile, leaving one to wonder about her intentions. Of course, they didn't need to understand. They cautiously eyed the group, but hesitated to act due to their inferior numbers. However, in their minds, they were calculating an escape route. "Seize them at once!" Melody Blackwood commanded sharply. The shadow guards, as if jolted awake, startled and revealed eyes as sharp as a wild beast's. Seeing the disadvantageous situation, the dark-clad figures quickly used the small figure as a shield, then launched an attack towards the shadow guards blocking their path. Striking first gives the advantage. Their tactic was indeed not bad, but William Monroe's side had been prepared. Those dark figures were simply no match for the shadow guards. Seeing their chance of escape dwindling, the dark figures exchanged glances and shifted their target to Melody Blackwood. This wasn't surprising. Among the many people present, she appeared the most vulnerable, the easiest target. Moreover, her status seemed quite high. The soft persimmon is always the first choice, and Melody Blackwood happened to be that soft persimmon in their eyes. Evading the shadow guard's attacks, 3 dark figures slipped through at a precarious angle. With swift movements, they reached Melody Blackwood's side in an instant. A cruel glint flashed in the eyes of one of the dark figures, reaching out to grab Melody Blackwood's neck. William Monroe, beside her, was startled and about to intervene when he saw her figure flash. She reached out, seizing the hands of 2 of the dark figures, pulling them so their hands tightened around each other's necks. Melody Blackwood smiled, her fingers darting out to touch several points on their bodies. The struggling dark figures suddenly froze. She nodded in satisfaction, surprised that such profound pressure point techniques could be successfully applied here. The remaining black-clad attacker luckily dodged Melody Blackwood's counterattack. Before he could launch his own, he lost his initial momentum and furtively tried to flee. William Monroe naturally wouldn't let him have his way. His figure flashed, blocking the black-clad man's path. He then lightly patted the man, who crumpled to the ground, his legs turning to jelly. "Overestimating your abilities," Melody Blackwood sneered, clapping her hands with an arrogant expression. Seeing the situation turn against them, the remaining black-clad men lost their will to fight. They took their own knives and slit their throats, falling dead to the ground. Finally, only the small figure remained, struggling weakly. The mystic weapon in their hand glowed with a blue light, but trembled incessantly, clearly terrified. #### Chapter 32 Lily Blackwood's Betrayal. Humph, humph! Melody Blackwood chuckled coldly, pulling a rope from her waist. With a light tap of her jade foot, she floated towards the person. Before they could react, she swiftly bound them. Good skills. William Monroe didn't spare his praise, striding towards Melody Blackwood with a laugh and a look of admiration. Then, looking at the struggling black-clad person, he suddenly froze, feeling a sense of familiarity. He withdrew his gaze, saying, "Shadow Guard, send someone to bring the living back for interrogation. Throw the dead into the mass grave." The Shadow Guard nodded, quickly giving orders to the dark guards. "Melody Blackwood, come with me," William Monroe continued, then headed towards the prison. News of the enemy's attack spread throughout the entire military camp in an instant. The soldiers spoke of Melody Blackwood and William Monroe's heroic capture of the enemy as if it were a miracle. For a time, the pain from their training lessened somewhat. Other generals, alerted by the commotion, rushed over, but were stopped by William Monroe, who declared his intention to conduct the interrogation himself. However, his bringing Melody Blackwood along further fueled the generals' long-standing discontent. Several of them whispered amongst themselves, debating whether to report the matter to His Majesty. After all, William Monroe was the Grand General, and his every action could affect the prosperity or demise of the Yen Kingdom. If, due to their negligence, he remained infatuated with that fair-faced individual, they would be eternal sinners. However, the two in the prison were completely unaware of their intentions. William Monroe sat on a chair, his face grim. Beside him Melody Blackwood, smiling brightly as a flower. A jailer stood behind them, holding torture instruments, his face bearing the usual subservient
and fawning expression. The black-clad individuals knelt before them, their bodies tightly bound, unable to move.
Speak! What did your Grand General send you here to do?
William Monroe began, his voice incredibly gentle, his gaze capable of melting a mountain of ice. However, the four black-clad individuals remained silent, heads bowed, not even bothering to glance at them.
Sigh!
Melody Blackwood shook her head, wearing an expression that said they were beyond help. A feather seemed to materialize in her hand, and she gave them a sinister smile. Then, she lifted her foot and quickly walked towards them. The black-clad figures looked at her suspiciously, their eyes revealing unwillingness.
Shameless!
The petite figure in black spoke indignantly, her defiant eyes revealing deep hatred. As if understanding something, Melody Blackwood nodded, slightly shifted her body, changed direction, and walked towards the small black-clad figure.
Unexpectedly, a woman.
Looking at the figure, she immediately recognized the gender of the small black-clad person, a sinister smile appearing on the corner of her lips as she slowly squatted down, looking down at her with an arrogant posture.
Humph!
She just snorted coldly, stubbornly turning her face away. Melody Blackwood wasn't angry at all. She reached out and grabbed her chin.
You know, I like women with your temperament the most. I've been in the barracks for a long time, and it's been a while since I've tasted the flavor of a woman.
As she spoke, she deliberately revealed hungry, wolf-like eyes, causing William Monroe beside her to shake his head in exasperation.
Let me see your face,
Melody Blackwood said darkly. Without waiting for her to react, her jade hand quickly snatched her mask.
It's you again!
A surprised voice rang out. Melody Blackwood couldn't believe her eyes as she looked at the woman in front of her, and after a long while, her surprise turned into disappointment. William Monroe suddenly jumped up from his chair, staring at the woman in front of him.
Lily Blackwood!
He gritted his teeth, forcing the two words out from between them. In an instant, anger filled his heart.
It's me, so what?
The small woman kneeling on the ground raised her head, looking at him defiantly. She had lost a lot of weight in the few days they hadn't seen each other, but her eyes still revealed a haughty and acrimonious look. Melody Blackwood looked at her with disappointment, shook her head, and stood up straight. Initially, she had intended to extract some clues about the enemy from them, but now it seemed impossible. Moreover, looking at the situation, it was highly likely that Lily Blackwood had already revealed all her information to the enemy.
Do you know you were wrong?
William Monroe suppressed his anger, sat down on the chair, and asked. Lily Blackwood turned her head away again, snorting coldly, not even bothering to look at the two of them. Wanting her to admit her mistake was clearly impossible. Melody Blackwood shook her head at William Monroe, standing silently to the side. Thinking back to the usual days, Lily Blackwood was just unreasonable, but at least she still had some good in her heart. Now, Melody Blackwood realized she was wrong. This Lily Blackwood was fundamentally the kind of person who didn't differentiate between right and wrong, selfish and self-serving. She could even hurt everyone for her own sake. The jailer beside them immediately realized that the situation had changed, signaled to the person next to him, then turned and quickly left the prison through the side door. The Blackwoods. Arthur Blackwood lay leisurely on the bed, holding a fragrant, living woman in his arms, his hands shamelessly groping her body, his eyes revealing intense lust.
Marquis, you're so naughty, I can't take it,
the woman said coquettishly, lowering her head. Arthur Blackwood chuckled.
Then I'll be gentle with you.
After saying that, he reached out to act. Suddenly, a burst of hurried footsteps came from outside. The figure stopped at their door, and the butler's voice followed.
Master, it's not good. Melody has colluded with the enemy and been captured.
Just as he finished speaking, Arthur Blackwood's hand froze.
He tilted his head in astonishment towards the closed door, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes.
"Is this true?" he asked. "The news just came from a spy planted in the barracks. He saw it with his own eyes. It must be true. My lord, you must go there quickly, otherwise the young Miss Life is in danger,"
the steward urged, his voice laced with anxiety. Lily Blackwood was Arthur Blackwood's precious daughter. He couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to her. Upon hearing the steward's words, his desire vanished instantly. Ignoring the alluring woman in his arms, he quickly dressed, mounted his horse, and galloped towards the barracks, fearing that any delay would mean his beloved daughter's death. William Monroe naturally wouldn't execute Lily Blackwood without cause. However, he never expected her to succumb to the enemy's enticements and surrender. Now, she had returned, leading enemy forces, to probe the Yin Kingdom's barracks. Although they had agreed to a 3-month truce, night ambushes didn't exactly constitute warfare. At worst, they were sneak attacks. The enemy exploited this loophole to send Lily Blackwood. However, they hadn't anticipated that Melody Blackwood had foreseen all of this. From the moment Lily Blackwood was captured, Melody Blackwood had instructed William Monroe to deploy hidden guards every day. As expected, they didn't have to wait long before the enemy launched their sneak attack.
"I'll have you know, I'm the Princess Royal, and quite possibly your future wife. You can't do anything to me."
After Lily Blackwood's capture, William Monroe ordered that she be denied food and water. Several days passed, and though weakened, she maintained her haughty demeanor. Unrepentant, she even threatened William Monroe. Yet, her words sounded utterly ridiculous to the two of them. What could the enemy have promised Lily Blackwood to make her betray her country so brazenly? A mocking smile played on William Monroe's lips. He looked at Lily Blackwood with a hint of pity, shaking his head.
"Do you think that being the Princess Royal exempts you from punishment for treason? Or do you believe His Majesty will pardon a traitor? Princess Royal? His Majesty granted you that title, and he can certainly take it away. As for being my future wife, that's complete fabrication. Please refrain from
such nonsense. I, William Monroe, will not marry a traitor."
William Monroe's words were truthful, but they held a different meaning for Lily Blackwood.
"Don't think I don't know about you and that pale-faced man exchanging glances. Let me tell you, every citizen of the Yin Kingdom, including myself, will never accept you being with a man."
Lily Blackwood sneered, glaring at Melody Blackwood. Clearly, if she weren't restrained, she would have lunged at Melody Blackwood to fight to the death.
Beyond reason,
Melody Blackwood sighed, shaking her head in disappointment. Lily Blackwood was bordering on madness. It was a pity there were no vaccines there. Otherwise, Melody Blackwood would have certainly given her a shot.
"Lock her up. Tomorrow, I will report this matter to my father. He will decide what to do."
William Monroe didn't want to waste any more words on her. This woman was beyond redemption. Talking was futile. Melody Blackwood nodded, not wanting to say anything more. She sighed, a deep weariness evident in her eyes.
"Your Excellency, have mercy."
An aged voice suddenly rang out from outside. Melody Blackwood and William Monroe froze, exchanging startled glances before turning towards the source of the sound. They saw Arthur Blackwood, clad in a black coat, trembling as he approached, his beard quivering in time with his steps.
"My foolish young daughter has erred. I implore your Excellency to show mercy."
He spoke again, reaching them and bowing deeply.
"Marquis, why are you here?"
William Monroe eyed him quizzically, a cold smile playing on his lips as understanding dawned. Clearly, he had anticipated that the Marquis had informants within the military camp. Arthur Blackwood raised his head, a sorrowful expression on his face, preparing for a display of abject humility.
"My daughter did not intentionally rebel. She is truly young and foolish. I, your loyal servant, implore your excellency to grant special clemency and let this matter pass."
With that, he knelt heavily, turning to look at Lily Blackwood beside him. His face contorted with heartache as he reached out to touch her cheek.
"My daughter has suffered. She's grown so thin in just a few days."
Lily Blackwood, wearing a pitiful expression, looked directly at Arthur Blackwood.
"Father, I want to go home."
Hearing William Monroe mention informing the Emperor, she felt a flicker of fear. If Henry Monroe refused to forgive her, her fate was sealed. Seeing Arthur Blackwood arrive was like grasping a lifeline.
"I'll take you home right away."
Arthur Blackwood's favoritism towards his daughter was well known, but William Monroe hadn't expected it to reach this extent. The contrast with Melody Blackwood's usual treatment was stark. William Monroe, intentionally or not, glanced at Melody Blackwood, but she remained impassive, as if the father-daughter reunion before her didn't affect her in the slightest. Melody Blackwood naturally wasn't bothered by this. She knew it wasn't worth it. After so many years in the Marquis's household, the former Melody Blackwood had long seen through everything, especially since she shared no blood ties with him. Her only lingering resentment stemmed from Arthur Blackwood's heartless betrayal of Mary Young. She considered it all water under the bridge. Now, the fate of his precious daughter rested on William Monroe's word. She was merely a spectator, watching to see how it all played out.
"I implore you, William Monroe, in consideration of my loyal service to the crown, to spare my daughter."
Arthur Blackwood knelt on the ground, his head bowed low, his face etched with sorrow. He no longer addressed William Monroe as "Your Excellency," but simply by name, a clear reminder of his own contributions to William Monroe's current position. William Monroe frowned slightly, his expression suggesting displeasure with Arthur Blackwood's words. He turned slightly, his gaze falling upon Melody Blackwood beside him. A complex emotion flickered in his eyes before he spoke.
"What do you think I should do?"
"Oh!" Melody Blackwood was taken aback, clearly not expecting to be consulted.
"This humble servant dares not presume to offer an opinion. The decision rests entirely with your excellency,"
she replied respectfully. William Monroe shook his head.
"Go on. This matter."
Melody Blackwood looked troubled, then glanced at Lily Blackwood and Arthur Blackwood.
"I implore the general to spare the princess."
After all, she and Lily Blackwood shared the same surname. If she were too ruthless, she wouldn't have peace of mind. William Monroe looked at Melody Blackwood in surprise, clearly not expecting her to say these words. He knew that Melody Blackwood was often bullied by them, and now that she finally had this opportunity, he thought she would definitely give them a harsh lesson before reporting to the court. But now it seemed he was wrong. He looked at Melody Blackwood, his gaze changing significantly. Arthur Blackwood looked at
Melody Blackwood suspiciously, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. He gave a soft grunt, feeling a sense of familiarity, but unable to recall where he had met her. After a moment's thought, he suddenly remembered. This was the pretty boy rumored to be in a homosexual relationship with William Monroe. He had thought it was just gossip, but seeing it with his own eyes, he finally understood. And it seemed William Monroe listened to him quite readily.
"Are you sure you want to spare her?"
William Monroe still found it hard to believe, asking again. Melody Blackwood nodded vigorously.
"Spare her. She came to plead with you in the middle of the night."
This sentence was spoken properly, but then her eyes lit up with a knowing smile.
"But if we just let her go, it's too easy for her. How about crippling her profound energy? What do you think?" "As you wish."
William Monroe nodded, agreeing without hesitation. Hearing this, Lily Blackwood's face immediately changed. She shook her head repeatedly, muttering, "No," incessantly.
"Marquis, what do you think?"
William Monroe ignored Lily Blackwood's agitated reaction and looked at Arthur Blackwood.
"Thank you, General, for your special mercy."
he replied in a deep voice. Weighing death against losing her profound energy, he naturally chose the latter. At least Lily Blackwood's life and chastity could be preserved. At worst, she would no longer be a princess, and he would support her for the rest of her life.
Thank him.
William Monroe pointed to Melody Blackwood beside him. Arthur Blackwood looked up at Melody Blackwood, shook his head, and said,
Thank you, young man. It's what I should do.
Melody Blackwood smiled and replied calmly, but her words puzzled him. He paused for a moment, but said nothing. Lily Blackwood, on the other hand, was still very unwilling. But since Arthur Blackwood had agreed, she had no choice, unless she chose to let the Emperor decide. Lily Blackwood was not a fool. She naturally knew the consequences if the Emperor found out about this. But she was just unwilling, which was why she reacted so strongly. But regardless, William Monroe personally crippled Lily Blackwood's power. Arthur Blackwood profusely expressed his gratitude to both of them. Melody Blackwood found it all rather noisy. She couldn't forget Arthur Blackwood's attitude towards her on the day she left the Marquis's residence. In the end, comparisons truly were odious. At least there was some comfort. She still had her mother marry young.
In the future, it's best not to let your precious daughter wander about, especially not in the military camp. If the enemy were to discover her, we wouldn't be able to save her.
William Monroe didn't forget to add a warning. His words sounded like concern for Lily Blackwood, but the underlying meaning was simple. Lily Blackwood should stay put at home from now on and not go anywhere. Arthur Blackwood didn't dare utter a word of disagreement, continuously nodding his head and thanking his lordship for his guidance. Melody Blackwood shook her head, remaining still as she watched Arthur Blackwood, her expression showing helplessness. Lily Blackwood's current predicament was largely due to his pampering. Ultimately, he bore a significant responsibility. As if sensing Melody Blackwood's gaze, Arthur Blackwood looked over, a puzzled expression on his wrinkled face. He felt he knew Melody Blackwood, but couldn't quite place her. But that wasn't important. The fact that Lily Blackwood was still alive was a blessing. Most importantly, her purity remained intact. After all, the Blackwoods were a loyal family. If they were ruined because of Lily Blackwood, he wouldn't be able to face his ancestors. Hastily bidding farewell to William Monroe, Arthur Blackwood stealthily led Lily Blackwood away through the back entrance. Chapter 33. Petty minds. Now that Lily Blackwood's mystic power was gone, she would surely settle down. It would also be a relief for those she had tormented, who had nowhere to hide. Seeing her silence before leaving, she would likely reflect on her actions at home for a few days. Melody Blackwood worried that the servants around her would instigate trouble, knowing that Lily Blackwood was easily swayed. But these matters no longer concerned Melody Blackwood. She had already granted Lily Blackwood clemency. As for the incident, William Monroe suppressed it, telling everyone that the others chose to bite their tongues and commit suicide rather than comply. After all, this was a secret interrogation. Apart from a few jailers, only Melody Blackwood knew what happened. And since Melody Blackwood had been the one to suggest releasing Lily Blackwood, William Monroe had nothing to worry about. He returned to his tent with Melody Blackwood, laughing and talking, but he sensed her unhappiness. He tried various ways to coax her, but she only said,
"I'm tired,"
before falling asleep on the bed. William Monroe shook his head, giving up. But he knew that despite her apparent indifference, Melody Blackwood was still upset. After all, she was a Blackwood too. The next day, a rumor spread through the military camp. All the soldiers whispered that Melody Blackwood was a pretty boy, seducing the general, who, bewitched by him, allowed him to participate in military affairs. In an instant, all the blame was directed at Melody Blackwood. In a group of men, where strength was the only measure, this fake man, Melody Blackwood, had risen to become William Monroe's favorite without any merit or hardship. No one was convinced. Instead, they felt Melody Blackwood should be eliminated. Even Melody Blackwood's risking her life to reclaim a city was seen as a treacherous act, accusing her of disregarding national security and gambling with the enemy. Several generals, already prejudiced against Melody Blackwood, held a clandestine discussion and swiftly decided to report the matter to His Majesty. William Monroe, oblivious to this, simply assumed they were sulking and offered a few placating words. However, as time wore on, the whispers in the military camp persisted. Melody Blackwood remained unconcerned, continuing to eat and drink as usual.
"Aren't you afraid something untoward might happen?"
William Monroe inquired. He truly couldn't fathom the source of Melody Blackwood's composure and confidence.
"What's there to be afraid of?"
Melody Blackwood scoffed, reflecting that she had never truly feared anything. Had she not been carelessly ensnared by an enemy's treacherous plot, transported to this strange place, it would likely be others who feared her. Hearing her response, William Monroe fell silent, a wry smile playing on his lips as he looked down at the Book of War on the table. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside. Both of them looked up in surprise, their gazes drawn to a group of royal guards clad in golden armor entering the room. Trailing behind them were the same generals, who held disdain for Melody Blackwood.
"Your Highness, William Monroe,"
they chorused, kneeling in unison. William Monroe nodded, a vague sense of foreboding rising within him. He gestured for them to rise and asked,
"What brings you here?" "His Majesty has summoned your Highness back to the palace,"
the royal guard replied in unison.